here again with credit expert and founder of Tier 1 Credit, Shiva Bhaskar. And today we're going to talk specifically about how student debt affects consumer credit and basically what are some of the options for people who have student debt. And particularly, we're going to talk about people who may have a lot of student debt and little or no income. So that's it. Thanks for being here, Shiva, and let's get right into it.
Great. Thank you, Parviz. So, the most important thing that I can say when it comes to student loan debt and credit is, as with any other type of credit, you want to always make sure that you pay your bills on time. Now, federal student loans are very unique in one sense, which is that they only mark you late if you're 3 months or 90 days behind on payments. So if you pay a month late or even 2 months late, with federal student loans, you're still given a grace period. It's only when you miss payments, miss the required or minimum amount for 3 months, 90 days, that you get hit. So the positive of that is it's easy to preserve your credit even if you don't have quite as much income as you'd like. And the second point to highlight is that having a lot of student loan debt does not really count against you, okay? And the reason is because your credit scores, the FICO score, does not take your income into consideration. So you could have a doctor or someone who has several hundred thousand in student loan debt, or a Wharton MBA, but they're going to make that money back in a few years with their income. So it's not an issue. And because they don't know that, unlike credit card debt, a lot of student loan debt has its own costs, but from a credit standpoint, it's not going to hurt you. What hurts you is being 90 days or more late. Now, someone might say, and this leads us into our second point, okay, if I can't afford to make the required payments to avoid being 90 days late, what do I do? And that's my second tip, which is know your options, okay? You have a variety of ways you can repay your student loans. You can apply for an income-based repayment plan where the amount that you pay is based on how much you earn. And if you don't earn very much, you won't pay a whole lot. You'll be paying for a period of about 10 years, and whatever remains at the end, the remaining balance, is forgiven. Now, that can carry tax consequences, so you should talk to an accountant, but still, it is a way for you to stay current and make payments without going into default. If you already defaulted, meaning you haven't paid for at least 6 months, and so the loan has been charged off, placed with the Department of Education, you can rehabilitate the loan. That is where you make 9 payments on time in a 10-month period. But those payments you make are not the standard payment amount. They're based on a calculation which considers your income as well as the federal poverty level for the area where you live. So basically it looks at your income and cost of living in your area, and it calculates based on that. And it's usually a pretty small amount. You pay on time nine times in the following 10 months, and then the loan is treated as current again. And if you paid late leading up when you defaulted, many of those late payments leading up to the default might also be removed, which will help your credit. Another option is public service loan forgiveness, where if you're, let's say, a police officer or a teacher or something like that, because you're serving the community instead of going into a perhaps more lucrative for-profit job, you can have your loans forgiven after a certain amount of time. So that's another option. So income-based repayment, rehab, public service loan forgiveness, of course, deferment and forbearance, where you don't make payments, for a period of time. You have a lot of options. Now, what that means is that you don't have to go into default or fall behind. You have a lot of things you can do, but that leads me to my third point, which is you need to take action on it. You need to communicate. So if you think you can't pay the required amount on your loan, you need to really communicate with your lender and let them know, listen, this is how much I make. This is what my current situation is. How can I preserve my credit and make payments? I want to pay, but I can't pay what's required here. And then you might look into income-based repayment, public service loan forgiveness. If you already fell behind, then it's been charged off, then rehabilitation. So it's really about knowing your options and then communicating. And then I've said a lot. Is there some follow-up question?
Is it the case, Shiva, that for the public service loan forgiveness, that's the exception as far as having the tax bomb at the end of the period when it's
Oh,
forgiven?
I should clarify. So, public service loan forgiveness does not come with the tax consequences. Public service loan forgiveness is because you're serving in a public capacity, is forgiving the loan outright.
Yep.
Income-based
Right.
repayment does come with tax consequences. If you qualify for PSLF, as we call it, public service loan forgiveness, you won't have any tax issues at the end of it. The challenge with public service loan forgiveness is that, relatively few people are working in those jobs who come out of a lot of professions. So you need to really make sure that where you're working qualifies as that. But if it does, yeah, it's a great option to save on your student loans and serve the community at the same time.
Got you. And I got another question, Shiva. If somebody goes into default with their student loans and then wants to take that corrective action, like you said, to do loan
Sure.
rehabilitation, you mentioned, first of all, they have to make 9 payments within 10 months. At the end of that period of time, let's say they're successful in having the 9 payments,
Sure.
um, what is reflected on their credit with regards to that default?
Sure. So basically, what usually will happen is if you look at your credit report after that, it'll be marked for the period from when you defaulted. It'll be retroactively marked as full year in good standing. Okay. So
There you go.
we
Yep.
had a client who had a couple years where they didn't pay and then went into rehabilitation. And for 2015 and 16, the years when that happened, it says full year in good standing. Now, there have been, this is a little bit of a murky area, and something that consumer lawyers talk about. There have been certain cases where certain lenders don't mark all of it or they leave certain late payments on. So it is something you want to clarify. But most of the big ones that we see, like Navy and Nelnet, them, if you rehabilitate the loan successfully, they'll mark it as such. And also, once you rehabilitate, you can go into any one of the programs I mentioned: income-based repayment, public service loan forgiveness, even forbearance or deferment. So it's really getting out of default and making that effort to bring your loan current by paying something that is really crucial here.
Got it, right. And so just to clarify, I mean, even if somebody has zero income, right, they can still call in basically and get back in good standing, right? Because if they have no income and if they're on an income-based repayment plan, then ostensibly the payment would be zero,
Correct.
correct?
Hypothetically, they could, and I do think there's people who do that, if they've left the workforce due to age or whatever it may be. However, in a case like that, you want to legitimately make sure that it is zero income because they can audit you, and
Right.
you want to make sure it's legitimate. But assuming it is due to, let's say, a disability or having a
Unem
child leaving the
Unemployment.
workforce, employment,
Yeah.
then yeah, absolutely you can. In some cases, though, I should mention, with unemployment especially, forbearance can often make sense, or deferment, rather than necessarily income-based repayment. But again, it depends on each person's unique dynamics and taking a look at that. And then the thing that I'd like to sort of, the fourth point that I think piggybacks on everything you've been asking, because this is a federal loan and the government is giving you access to education, and because there's so many repayment options. I mean, you couldn't go to a private lender. You can't go to Capital One, not pay your credit card, and tell them I want income-based repayment. They'll see you in court. And I was just on the phone with someone before we got on here who is dealing with exactly that, unfortunately. And so, because there's so many options when it comes to federal student loans, Parviz, you also have to enter into, you got to make some kind of effort. Okay, meaning if you choose not to pay and not to communicate at all, then federal student lenders are allowed to take money from your tax refund, potentially all of your tax refund. It's called a tax offset, to reduce the cost of your student loans. They can garnish money from your wages or freeze your bank account and take money based on certain guidelines and rules, but they don't have to get a judgment or go to court if it's a federal student loan. So the government is given a lot of capacity to seek repayment of the loan. So they offer a lot of flexible plans. But the downside, or not the downside, but the consideration of that is you need to communicate with them and make an effort to enter into some sort of repayment plan, because it's really not, very rarely can you discharge a federal student loan in bankruptcy, first. And secondly, if you don't go into one of these plans, they are going to, potentially garnish you or take money from your tax refund. So just to recap, try to pay on time always. Okay, you have 90 days in a sense, so that does help you. there will be late fees if you're 30 days late. Don't get me wrong, but you won't have it on your credit. Having a lot of student loan debt doesn't mean you'll have bad credit. You can have great credit as long as you pay on time. Understand your options: forbearance, deferment, rehabilitation, public service loan forgiveness, income-based repayment, and take action on those, meaning communicate. If you need one of those, there's no shame in it, but you need to tell the lender. They can't read your mind, right? And
Right,
then
right.
lastly, whatever you do, make sure you use one of these plans, because if you don't, it won't just be your credit you have to worry about, but also having your wages garnished and other things. So, yeah.
Got you, got you. So, I mean, if somebody is in default, or let's say they're not in default, but they have a ton of student loan debt, and
We're,
maybe they've missed some payments,
we're
basically from what you're saying is that once they pull themselves out of default, and if they take some other corrective actions, like you and I spoke about in the other video we did about
sure.
2 months ago, ostensibly they could have their credit back in shape within a year or two. Is that fair
They
to say?
could, they could. I often see that happen. If they're able to bring the loan current and then go into some sort of other repayment plan and continue paying. I see a lot of people who bounce back in a year. Now, I should clarify one thing with the late payments. Let's say you paid late, 90 or 120 days late, then you made some payments, and then you defaulted. Okay. Doing rehabilitation will typically remove the late payments from when you defaulted. But
Oh,
that time when you went 90 or 120 days late and then came current again, those usually won't be removed because those were not associated with the default.
oh,
So
wow.
rehabilitation is not a catch-all. It is to cure the late payments and the credit damage from the default itself. Okay. If you've had multiple times when you went 90 days late and then you defaulted a couple years later, the default is what this will address. The other 90-day lates are not getting removed except potentially through credit repair. But even there, uh, we find that unless you consolidate the loans and close the account and have a new consolidated loan, removing multiple 90-day lates is pretty tricky. So I really suggest that the moment you run into trouble, get on some kind of repayment plan to avoid paying us to clean up the damage later. Yeah.
Got you, got you. So it's kind of funny, right? That creates kind of the odd effect that going into default actually down the line
Exactly.
potentially could be healthier for your credit. Obviously,
Exactly.
that's not what you're advocating or what I'm advocating, but it sounds like kind of a peculiar, result that can
It
come from this.
is. It is. And the reason why it exists is because going into default means there's a very real potential that the government will not recover any money. They want to create a real incentive. I mean, you have the incentive of not having your wages garnished, but they want to create other incentives for you to repay the loan. So, yeah, it's definitely correct. But if you have a few late payments and you didn't default, I just suggest consolidating the account, and then you can contact us or look online or do whatever it may be. If the loan is consolidated and closed, the original account with the late, it may be possible to remove the account if there's inconsistencies. So that is an approach that we use. But keeping the account and removing individual late payments is obviously very tricky because usually they are accurate. So, yeah.
Got you, got you. And one other question. So we spoke a little bit here about how to deal with federal student loans. Can you talk a little bit about what somebody should do if they're dealing with private loans?
Pray. I'm kidding. Um, well, no, there are private lenders that'll work with you on repayment plans. Okay, there definitely are, but private lenders are not bound by the same rules as far as income-based repayment and so on and so forth. Generally, because they want the loan secured because they want the loan repaid, and particularly because many private student loans can be discharged in bankruptcy. Generally, they will work with you to settle it, but usually you're not going to see the late payments removed if you default on a private loan. And private student lenders can be fairly aggressive about going to court. And federal student lenders don't have to because they can just garnish you. Private student lenders will take you to court, and that can lead to having to pay attorney's fees and a lot of other things to have proper legal representation. So I suggest avoiding private student loans, except for one situation, which is, if you have a good job and you can get a much lower rate from a private lender and you've been paying on time for X number of years, at least 3 or 4 years out of school, refinancing with SoFi or Credible into a private loan could make sense. But outside of that, I typically would avoid doing that. And, if you need to take a small private loan because, okay, you have some personal expenses while you're in school, it's understandable. But avoid financing more than maybe 10 to 15% of your education with private loans at the most. Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Anything else you'd like to add before we finish this quick discussion?
I think we've covered everything. What I really want to say is, as we talked about in the last video, it's about understanding that you have options and then exercising them. There's so many ways to protect your credit and to repay your loans, even if your income is not as high as you would like it to be. So really, you should just focus on how can you exercise those options. There's really no reason to go. I won't say there's no reason to go in the default, but there's no reason after you go in the default not to bring the loan current and not to work on it, because ultimately it'll catch up with you in terms of credit damage, being garnished, and so on. So yeah, if you're willing to put in a little bit of work to learn, it can certainly be done. And the Department of Education website offers a lot of great resources, or you can contact us and we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, great. And yeah, in order to contact you, of course, I'm going to put your contact information and all your
Please.
social media handles in the description of the video. And then lastly, for anybody who wants to find out your other tips on how to rehabilitate credit, of course, they can go back and reference the video we did 2 months ago. It is titled, "What are the top 5 ways to rebuild credit?" So that's it. Thanks a lot, Shiva. We're looking forward to hearing more from you in the future about your tips and what you're discovering.
Great. Thanks for having me. We'll talk soon.